Most people think they are responding to reality, but much of the time, they are responding to fear, identity, memory, pressure, and prediction. And when this happens long enough, reality itself becomes difficult to feel clearly. You can see this in the smallest moments. A simple decision becomes heavy, not because the decision itself is complicated, but because the nervous system no longer feels safe with uncertainty. So the mind starts searching, more thinking, more analysis, more internal negotiation. You begin needing certainty before you move, needing guarantees before you act, needing to know how everything will end before you can take the next step. And slowly, life stops feeling relational and starts feeling dangerous. Neutral situations begin feeling loaded. Silence feels like rejection. Delay feels like failure. Uncertainty feels like something is wrong. Even your emotional reactions start feeling like truth. If anxiety appears, the mind assumes danger. If doubt appears, the mind assumes misalignment. If discomfort appears, the self immediately tries to escape, fix, or control something. And after enough time living this way, you can begin feeling disconnected from life itself, still functioning, still achieving, still moving, but no longer fully in contact. Because when the system becomes organized around protection, reality is no longer being met directly. It is being filtered through survival. Reality here does not simply mean the external world. It means the ongoing feedback that emerges through contact. Life is continuously responding, not always in the dramatic ways people expect, often quietly, subtly, through tension, ease, resistance, expansion, contraction. The body usually registers this long before the mind understands it. You walk into a room and something tightens. A conversation leaves you exhausted, even though nothing bad happened. A decision that looks correct on paper continues feeling heavy internally. The mind often tries to explain these experiences afterward, but the nervous system has already responded before the explanation appears. This is why intuition matters in this work. Intuition proposes, but reality responds. A direction may feel right internally, but reality reveals whether it actually integrates, whether it holds, whether it creates coherence or distortion once lived. And this is where identity begins interfering, because identity does not simply want truth, it wants stability. So the moment a particular outcome becomes emotionally necessary, perception starts narrowing around it. You begin seeing rejection where uncertainty exists. You interpret delay as failure. You force decisions because not knowing feels unbearable. You cling to certainty because uncertainty destabilizes the self. And slowly, contact with reality weakens, not because reality disappeared, but because perception became organized around protection. The nervous system does not primarily organize around truth. It organizes around safety. That means people will often protect familiar emotional structures, even when those structures create suffering, not consciously, somatically. A person may stay in work that no longer fits because uncertainty feels more dangerous than misalignment. Someone may pursue achievement compulsively, not because they truly want the achievement itself, but because accomplishment temporarily stabilizes self-worth. A relationship may continue long after connection has faded because losing the relationship feels like losing identity. Even rigid beliefs can function this way, not as clarity, but as emotional stabilization, because certainty can feel safer than openness. And when this becomes visible, something important begins to soften. You start realizing that perception is not entirely objective. The way reality is experienced is deeply shaped by regulation, safety, and contact. Not shamefully, not as failure, simply accurately. The more regulated the system becomes, the less reality needs to be distorted in order for the self to feel safe within it. When contact weakens, control increases. This is one of the clearest signs that the system is no longer fully responding to reality. Because when reality stops matching identity, force begins appearing. The self starts imposing rather than listening. Instead of remaining in contact with what is actually happening, attention narrows around what must happen in order for the self to feel stable. And this changes the quality of effort completely. Effort becomes heavier, more urgent, more emotionally charged, not because life necessarily became harder, but because responsiveness decreased. The system stopped relating and started controlling, and slowly, life begins feeling adversarial instead of relational. Everything becomes something to manage. Time, people, outcomes, perception, emotion. Even uncertainty itself starts feeling intolerable. So the mind compensates through analysis. You try to think your way into clarity. You overprocess decisions. You repeatedly revisit the same possibilities, hoping certainty will finally appear. But the more force enters the process, the harder clarity becomes to access, because pressure distorts perception. This is why people begin forcing timelines, needing things to happen quickly, needing answers immediately, needing movement because stillness feels emotionally unsafe. The nervous system begins treating unresolved reality as danger, and once identity becomes attached to a specific future, feedback itself becomes threatening. Resistance gets interpreted as failure, delay gets interpreted as collapse, contradiction gets ignored because it destabilizes the story the self is trying to maintain. So instead of reality shaping direction, identity begins filtering reality, and eventually the person no longer feels in dialogue with life. They feel trapped inside pressure. But reality is not punishing you. It is responding to the conditions present within the system. That is a very different thing. This is not blame. It is feedback. If the system is organized around fear, urgency, self-protection, or emotional instability, then movement itself becomes distorted, not morally, mechanically. This is why success can sometimes feel strangely empty, because the achievement arrived, but the system that pursued it was never actually in contact with itself during the process. Sometimes people collapse immediately after reaching a goal because the nervous system was held together by pursuit itself. Once the goal arrives, the organizing tension disappears, and what was previously covered by momentum becomes visible. This is also why expansion destabilizes unprepared systems. More money, more visibility, more responsibility, more success. None of these automatically create coherence. If capacity does not expand alongside external growth, life begins feeling heavier rather than freer. And forcing only makes this worse, because force can produce outcomes temporarily, but those outcomes often become brittle, difficult to sustain, emotionally expensive, internally fragmented. Alignment cannot be manufactured through pressure, because pressure itself is often the signal that contact has already weakened. The more identity depends on an outcome, the harder it becomes to perceive reality accurately, not because the person is unintelligent, but because survival-based attachment narrows perception. And as this becomes visible, something important starts relaxing. The system no longer has to force clarity into existence. It no longer has to dominate reality in order to feel safe. Pressure begins softening, and in that softening, contact slowly returns. Aligned achievement does not come from controlling reality. It comes from remaining accurate in relationship with it. That is a very different orientation. Most people have been taught to approach life through control. Control your future, control outcomes, control perception, control emotion, control uncertainty. But the more life is approached this way, the more disconnected the system often becomes from actual contact, because reality is not something static that can simply be dominated into compliance. Reality responds continuously, and when force softens enough, this becomes easier to feel. Actions generate feedback. Feedback refines direction. Direction changes through participation. Clarity is not something fully constructed in advance. It emerges through contact. This is why aligned movement often feels quieter than force-based movement. There is less internal argument, less urgency, less overcorrection. The system becomes more responsive instead of more controlling. And responsiveness is a form of intelligence. You begin listening instead of imposing, participating instead of dominating, adjusting instead of defending. Coherence starts becoming more important than performance, because performance can often override the system temporarily, while coherence allows movement to remain sustainable. This is also where capacity becomes more important than force. Force asks, how do I make this happen? Capacity asks, what can actually be held without fragmentation? That question changes everything. Because much suffering comes from trying to expand externally faster than the nervous system can integrate internally. And the more regulated the system becomes, the less reality needs to be controlled. Not because life suddenly becomes predictable, but because the self no longer requires certainty in order to remain present. This creates a very different relationship with action. Movement becomes cleaner, more direct, less emotionally inflated. And importantly, this is not passivity. It is not avoidance, not abandoning responsibility, not waiting endlessly for signs from the universe, not giving up ambition or direction. In many ways, it requires more honesty than force does, because force can ignore feedback, contact cannot. This orientation asks something quieter and more difficult. Can you remain responsive enough to reality that movement stays coherent? Can you listen without collapsing, adjust without shame, pause without panic, move without needing control to create safety? Because aligned achievement is not the absence of action. It is action that remains in relationship with reality while it unfolds. Much of human suffering comes from trying to force life into forms that no longer fit. Trying to force clarity, force identity, force certainty, force timelines, force outcomes. Trying to make life conform to structures the nervous system believes are necessary for safety. But reality continues responding anyway, not through punishment, not through reward, through feedback. Sometimes that feedback arrives as tension, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes confusion, sometimes the strange feeling that something no longer fits, even when it once did. And often the self interprets these moments as failure, but many times they are invitations into deeper contact. Invitations to stop overriding what the system is already registering, to stop forcing movement that no longer feels coherent, to stop organizing life entirely around fear, prediction, and control. And when the nervous system no longer needs certainty in order to remain present, life becomes easier to hear. Not because all uncertainty disappears, but because the self no longer needs to defend itself against reality in the same way. There is more space, more listening, more responsiveness. Movement becomes quieter, cleaner, less divided internally. And slowly, life stops feeling like something that must constantly be managed. It begins feeling relational again. You may not need to control reality as much as your system believes. You may only need enough stability to remain in contact with it.